exegesis.
Right. So you have to actually do the work for the filmmakers, which brings us back to what I was saying about them. They didn't really know what they were doing at the first one. It was just like something came through them, and then when they actually attempted to develop it in keeping with all the expectations and all the readings that had been done of the first film, there was just no way, because they weren't actually working with their personal shadow matter on those films, the Wachowskis. God only knows, what was really behind the Matrix. It seemed like the whole film was a sort of psyop, like the Star Wars films, that there were just many hands and many minds behind it. The thing with the false messiah, I think, it might be a sidetrack, but it's kind of interesting to me, because what makes a messiah false is that people turn him into something that he's not, and they turn him into an excuse not to have to be what he is. So this happened with Christ and Christianity, and with Neo, as I wrote in Matrix Warrior, he may be the one, but he's not the only. He's the first. That's what made him the one. And there's always going to be a first. I mean, if Jesus Christ existed, then he was the first to become a full embodiment of God in a physical body. But what would be the point of that if it wasn't going to create a chain reaction by which the whole species began to embody God? And so then God would have many organs of perception and not just the one. The alternative is for Christ to become the king of humanity and to have everybody worshipping at his feet, which is what Lucifer wanted. So then Christ would become Satan. I think the Matrix was sort of toying with that, but it just didn't really grok it, that the Neo was part of the program. So then he was a test, because if people just bought into the prophecy baloney and worshipped him as the one, they wouldn't recognize what the true meaning of his existence, which was that everyone is the one, because we're all hooked into the program and we can all shape reality, and we can all, like Christ said, those who come after me will do even greater miracles. So what does that mean? That means that he was passing on a virus that would spread and take over the whole system until it became fully conscious of itself, at which point the Matrix ends, because then it's like a shell that cracks open. It served its purpose. But it's not to do with fighting the Matrix from within. I mean, a caterpillar doesn't fight to get out of the chrysalis. That wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Caterpillar does is surrender to its knowing, which is that this is its, this is what it has to do, and then the butterfly emerges from that state of surrender, and then the chrysalis cracks, and a whole new state of being is attained, but there wasn't any struggle or resistance, or revolutionary movement required for that to happen.
You also write about the great American psycho in cinema and why audiences feel so drawn to this character. And what I'm getting, and I don't know if this ties in a little bit to Neo becoming Lucifer, but we love the great American psycho, whether it's Hannibal Lecter, I guess would be the best example, but there are many more, because this person is basically God. God kills and it's good, that's great. God makes reality what he wants, and that's great. Is that why we're truly drawn to the American psycho?
I think it's more to do with, back to the shadow really, that the psycho, and I don't consider Hannibal Lecter to be a good example of this. I mean, he's an obvious example because he's
the most famous.
He's the most famous, but also he, as a character, as a concept, he kind of exposes the machinery of the great American psychopath, which, by the way, is Phil Snyder's thesis. We worked together on that chapter, so you might want to talk to Phil about this too at some point. But neither of us put much stock in Hannibal Lecter because he's not actually believable as a character. That he doesn't represent a kind of person in society. They simply don't exist. These psychopaths who are enlightened beings. So Hannibal Lecter actually glamorizes and idealizes the psychopath But by doing so, he does kind of show it's a sort of living thesis, really, in that, yes, he is imitating God. Yes, he is on a quest for transcendence. He is the ultimate predator. I guess it combines sort of two apparently opposing desires or urges in ourselves, in our psyche. One is the bid for transcendence, to become God, to transcend the physical, the freedom from the identity, etc. And the other is this pertaining to the shadow, which is, depending on how conscious it is, it's either, if it's conscious, it is the drive or the bid to integrate the shadow, which entails embodying the shadow. So then it entails recognizing the Travis Bickle, the Charles Manson in ourselves, that we're all capable of that. And if society spews forth these individuals, they're also embodiments of the collective shadow. They're not just random products of society or products of MK Ultra or what have you. Like the movies, they are part of a collective, and so they're reflecting back at us. And so an awareness of that naturally attracts us to these characters, because we recognize that they embody aspects of ourselves that we need to integrate in order to be whole. Now, if that's unconscious, then what happens is either we revile the psychopath and say he should be shut away, he should be executed, he's scum, he's evil, he's the enemy of society, which is the more kind of socially sanctioned reaction, or, as is getting more and more prevalent, we idealize and worship the psychopath and consider him to be this rebel figure, this heroic figure, who is at least, individual. He's an individual spirit. The basic kind of American model for a hero, like John Wayne, is really a psychopath. If we actually look at those movies, particularly The Searchers, Clint Eastwood did it in Unforgiven. He came clean and said, actually, I'm a psychopath. My character's a psychopath with demons. He's wounded. But even in that movie, he got to be the good guy by the end, because Clint created a bad guy that was so nasty that we want Clint to kill him. So then we actually, there's this double thing that even when we are allowed to see the truth, we don't care. We say, okay, Clint's a psychopath, but he's our psychopath.
I guess the culmination would be the movie Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
Where the psychopaths are completely deified.
Yeah, and they're the only likable characters in the movie.
Yeah, in comparison.
In comparison to Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Downey Jr., the real scum, then we have to kind of like and even admire Mickey and Mallory. I mean, Mickey, I would say, is closer to a believable, transcending psychopath than Hannibal Lecter. He's closer to what Manson appeared to be, in that he's turning murder into a philosophy. And I guess there is something basically appealing about that, because of us having to repress and disown our primal instincts. To be civilized means to repress that side. We have to repress the desire to kill anyone who gets on our nerves, or to rape any woman that we are attracted to. These are primal urges that obviously we need to repress them, otherwise we're going to get into trouble.
Yeah, but all of our primal urges, even the lesser ones are suppressed.
Well, right.
We can't talk at work, we can't talk back to our boss or our wives.
Right.
They're all repressed. And I guess that was what Freud was starting to address 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think when violence and sexuality are, because they're so closely linked, like in the animal kingdom, the sexual act is often violent. It's the same sort of energy that's coming out, creation, destruction. So it figures, yin and yang, they're going to be very closely intertwined. But because of this, then, as human beings, we the odd thing, Miguel, is that we seem to be more ashamed of our sexuality than our violent nature. We consider repressing our violent side to be a good thing, of course. Violence is bad, violence is hostile, it's antisocial. There's no excuse for violence unless, of course, it's on a mass scale and it's called war. But individual violence must be punished. But then on the other hand, although sex is considered a good thing, really, and it's encouraged and it's propagated through the media, so it's coming out of our ears, we are still programmed from our youth to be deeply ashamed of our sexuality, and I would say more ashamed. Like if a child is caught playing with his ding-dong, he probably gets more shamed for it by his parents than if he hits his little sister, or at least equally. So that passing on generational shame around sexuality, it ties into the suppression of our violent instincts and urges. So if we repress our sexuality as well as our antisociality, then essentially that's it. We're repressing everything. Really, that doesn't leave anything to express, really, because in a way everything's an expression of sexuality. And violence itself is a sort of, because it's a territorial thing and a protective thing and a way to get a mate, that the strongest gets laid kind of thing. Violence, you could say, is even a side effect of sexuality. So perhaps that's why there's this bid to suppress our sexuality and to distort it. And I think we're inundated with it. That's part of the same program, because if sexuality is communicated and propagated in a way that's extremely coarse and puerile and titillating and all the rest of it, then that intensifies the sense of shame, because we're constantly being sexually triggered while at the same time knowing that it's kind of unclean, because it is. Pornography is unclean, the sexual advertising is unclean, and these things do increase, because they increase our sexual desires, they trigger our sexual desires, our hormonal responses, without providing an outlet. They also increase violence and savagery in the society, because if you're constantly surrounded by sexual imagery without an outlet for it, then it's going to come out in other ways.
In your introduction, Jason, you bring up the term synchromysticism. I don't recall you using it again, although it's an extremely fascinating concept, especially when you tie it in with your views on paranoia in cinema. What exactly is synchromysticism?
Synchromysticism is a movement on the internet which has, I don't know how many proponents. I only know of very few: Jake Coetzee, Chris Knowles, Steve Wilner. There's a bunch that I know personally, and then there's a whole bunch of others that I don't have any idea about. And it's to do with finding hidden meaning in pop culture. To do with reading artifacts of popular culture for recurring themes and motifs that indicate a sort of emerging Gnostic movement, if you will, an awakening, a global awakening. It's Jung's synchronicity taken to, narrowed down to a very specific thing. Synchromysticism is no different than synchronicity, really. It's just that movement that calls itself synchromystic chooses to focus on popular culture exclusively, rather than the whole of existence, as Jung did.
And what are some examples of things that have been seen or that this movement have noted?
The thing in Matrix that Neo's, Thomas Anderson's passport expires on September 11th, 2001, that would be an example of, woo, wow. That's a very sort of specific example that in a way that's slightly different what the synchromystics do. That's almost close to conspiracy theory, because, oh, well, maybe that was put there by people who knew, But it could also be something the synchromystics would pick up on, that it's a clue that 9/11 was this Stargate that was to do with, a wobble in consensus reality, like the Matrix program breaking down, and which I think there's some truth in that. So that would be a way to link together The Matrix with 9/11 and turn that into a narrative that includes both. To be honest, a lot of synchromysticism I find very trivial. It's to do with